Hey there, it's Chris from Good Roads. You guys have been asking for it. I've heard you. I agree. It's about time. We're getting back to the snowboard build. For those of you who are new to the channel, last spring I embarked on the project to build my first fully featured snowboard. That means a composite layup, a P-Tex base, a fully profiled core, steel edges, the whole shebang. And if you want to get caught up, I've got a playlist of that project up till this point. You can check it out. I had to rename it because we're not in the spring anymore. But for the short version, here's where I had left off. I made my core blank. I routed and cast urethane sidewalls in that blank. I made my base sheet and I bent and attached my steel edges, making tools and jigs all the way through the project. And the next step that I wanted to tackle is profiling the core. The core of a snowboard has a center section, which is usually one thickness all the way through, basically to just beyond your feet. Sometimes that can be varied. And then it tapers out into the nose and tail so that the nose and tail have more flex than the center of the board. The easiest way to do this would have been to just grab my hand belt sander and try to sand down the ends of my core template, but I wanted something that was a little bit more accurate, a little bit more repeatable, and little did I know, I was in for a much harder time than I expected. The method that I want to try, I've seen in a couple small shop tours of different small snowboard manufacturers, and it's a pretty cool technique. What it is you make a cradle of the negative of your profile of your core, and then you rest your core in that cradle and run it through some machine like a planer or sander in order to remove material from the tip and tail. And when you pop it back out of the cradle, it has the profile you want. If that sounds confusing, don't worry about it. I'm about to go through the whole process so you'll get to see what it looks like. So there's two components to this technique. There's the cradle and there's the stock removal tool. And let's start with talking about the cradle. For my core, I want to start with a 6.5 millimeter width in the center, tapering down to 2 millimeters at the tip of the nose and the tail. My board's directional. It's got a big volume shifted hull, so my tail's pretty short, but my nose is pretty long. And that makes for a really subtle, gradual taper. And I wasn't sure that any of the tools that I had in the shop were capable of making a 3 millimeter, 4 millimeter stock removal over however long the distance of my nose was. But my 3D printer might be. So I made these. These are printed panels that give me the very subtle wedges for the cradle that I want to use to profile my nose and tail tapers. I actually made these parts back in the spring, and it's where I got the idea for the 3D printed skateboard mold, but I just haven't put them into use until now. Now that I know that that mold works, these parts are definitely going to work for what we need. All I had to do was attach them to a backing board in an orientation that put the tapers where I wanted them in my core. Once those parts were in place, I had a core profiling cradle with really precise shapes. So the next thing that I needed in order to utilize this method is something to feed that cradle and the core through that will remove material. The original plan was to use my planer, but back when I did my urethane sidewall experiments, I ran into a lot of issues with sniping and tearing out. So I was hoping to be able to do something that would be a little bit more gentle on my core. My first attempt at getting that right was to build a drum sander, which worked for a little while, but it turns out that PLA parts just don't stand up well to high speed, high friction environments. Go figure. Well, there's another pretty common method, which is to make a router sled, so I knocked one of those together too. But when I tested it, I wasn't super happy with the results. And I also wasn't sure if it would work with the cradle method because it usually requires some down pressure on the core blank. So after a couple dead ends and a lot of deliberation, I decided to just circle back to what was scaring me to begin with, and I tried using my planer. I seated the core in the cradle using the masking tape and superglue method, then started running it through the planer, taking as small an amount of material off each pass as I could manage. The urethane sidewalls on the nose and tail were cast in a channel routed into the core blank, so the first thing I needed to do was plane through the wooden bottom of that channel to expose the urethane. Once that was done, I flipped the core because the urethane on the other side still had the rough surface from casting. With the core oriented this way, I could keep taking material off until I hit the dimensions I was looking for. After a quick check against one of my binding inserts, I popped the core out of the cradle and checked my measurements. And hey, we're looking pretty good. Now, unfortunately, the thing that I was afraid would happen with the planer did. The urethane for the nose and tail busted out, which is disappointing because it calls into question some of the methods that I used or materials. It might have been the urethane as well. But for this board, I don't think it has to be a deal breaker. What I'm gonna do instead is get a hold of some P-Tex nose and tail filler material and just join that into the board. It's a different approach than the one I've been taking with this build so far, but it is an industry standard construction method. I've already got the material on order, so once that comes in, we should be good to go. But like I said, it does call into question the material, and it does make me a little worried about the sidewalls and worried that they might be too brittle. I think that having the urethane sandwiched between 2 layers of glass cloth and epoxy, the base, the edges, and the top sheet should really help reinforce it and make it more robust, but I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Are there any snowboard builders out there that cast urethane sidewalls? If you do, what urethanes do you use? I'd like to have a backup in case this one doesn't pan out. But with that issue aside, here we are. The snowboard build is back on, and it's gonna be woven into a whole bunch of other projects that I have going on right now. While I'm waiting on that material, we'll probably be bouncing back and forth between some other topics that I wanna cover and back to the snowboard. And speaking of other projects, I've got to shout out Null Block's Zachary Wilson, Not Pro Chris, and Nick Candeloro. These guys are my first 3 supporters on Patreon. With their support, I'm already more than halfway to funding the skateboard urethane experiments, so thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. It really means a lot to me, and I'm really excited about getting to tackle those projects. So, if you want to keep up with the snowboard build, the urethane experiments, and all the other projects we do here on the channel, why not subscribe? If you'd like to lend a hand with some support, why not check out the Patreon? If you got questions or comments, leave them down below. I do my best to get to all of them. As always, I appreciate having you guys along for the ride, and until next time, I'll see you soon.